This will be a 2-hour session. The first hour will be dedicated to the presentations and the second hour to the Q&A. We plan to wrap it up at the end of the second hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your question through Slido at slido.com using hashtag RISESIG. Okay, so today our webinar is on the topic of the AEMO's Renewable Integration Impact Assessment. Based on registrations, it looks like this is a topic of incredibly high interest. AEMO recently released a renewable integration study, which evaluates the technical challenges associated with reliance on high levels of renewable energy resources and the actions that must be taken to support them. The study focuses on the time period up to 2025, when AEMO forecasts that at times, as much as 75% of energy could be provided by wind and solar resources, and under a high growth scenario, as much as 100%. Australia's national electricity market has 17 gigawatts of wind and solar generation capacity today. The webinar will feature some opening remarks by Audrey Zibelman, the Managing Director and CEO of AEMO, followed by a detailed presentation by Chris Davies, Manager of Future Energy Systems at AEMO, and Barry O'Connell, a Principal Engineer in Future Energy Systems. Audrey oversees all of AEMO's strategic, operations, and administrative functions and responsibilities. She has years international experience in the public, private, and not-for-profit energy sectors. Many of you will remember her from her time as chair of the New York State Public Service Commission prior to joining AEMO in March of 2017, and her groundbreaking work there on the New York REV. Chris Davies is responsible for AEMO's Future Energy Systems team, whose core function is to identify and communicate emerging power system limits as the generation mix changes. The remit of the team includes addressing how these limits can be alleviated, including reviewing technical requirements and standards, and the technical specification of system services. Barry O'Connell is leading AEMO's renewable integration study. In a past life, Barry worked for AirGrid, the system operator for Ireland and Northern Ireland, supporting the transition to very high penetrations of wind generation. Barry worked in a number of roles across operations, planning, market design, and innovation on the DS3 program, which has been presented previously at ESIG by Jonathan O'Sullivan. I feel very fortunate to have Audrey, Chris, and Barry here with us today. For those of you who have been on ESIG webinars before, you know that as a matter of general interest, I like to go on LinkedIn and see how many connections I have in common with the webinar speakers. Well, I did just that, and I found out that we have 142 common contacts, which was a pleasant surprise for me. I greatly value the contributions of Audrey, Chris, Barry, and AEMO to ESIG and the industry, and I look forward to what they have to say. The planned topics for discussion during the webinar today include what the Renewable Integration Study is and how it originated, the areas of study in the report, including managing distributed PV, variability, and frequency, key findings and actions, and what the findings mean for managing the transition of the power system. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Audrey, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's good to see some names and people from former colleagues from the US and friends from Europe who've joined us. Look, I would be remiss if I didn't actually start our conversation with what I know all of us are sort of reeling from in terms of the events going on around the world. I just came back from a few weeks in the US where I got to spend some time with my brand new grandson, and you know, it's very difficult, I think, for all of us, particularly those of us who are raising children and now grandchildren, to think about what's happening. So, you know, for AEMO, it's amazing, but we went through one of our harshest summers several months ago, and that seems like a distant memory because then we certainly, like all of you, began to deal with COVID, and now in the U.S. The strife that's occurring, the sadness of George Floyd's death, and the pain that I know many of you are feeling. As I see some people who've worked with me in Minnesota, know that I spent 25 years of my life raising my family there, and then also from Philadelphia and of course New York. These are cities that are unrecognizable for what we all know is the spirit of those communities and just the pain that's going on. So I feel for all of you, and I think though this is important what we're doing because it's the type of thing, and I'm particularly proud of the approach that we're taking, is where we need and what we can do for those of us in this industry, because we can offer a better future. So with that, let me take just a few minutes. So Australian Energy Market Operator is very much like the RTOs in the US. Our difference is that we really have two primary grids in Australia, the Eastern grid and the Western grid, both of which are not interconnected, in fact, very distant from each other. AEMO operates both of those as a system operator. We also have a role as a system planner, and we also operate the markets and actually have a gas role as a gas operator too, which is a bit different than the US RTOs. But as the national operator, we have a really critical role in helping Australia steer to the future of energy. Now, many of you may not follow Australian politics and climate politics as closely as Australia follows everybody else's. But in Australia, we are seeing this incredible growth in rooftop solar. We're per capita the fastest growing economy. One of my heuristics that I use is that we're putting on rooftop solar, a new solar panel one time every 6 minutes. And so we are fully expecting up to 20% and even more of our energy coming from rooftop solar in the foreseeable future. On top of that, it's extremely good climate for wind and solar energy. And so even while we do have some policies, local policies around supporting renewable development, what we're forecasting is at this point, as our coal plant retires, which we expect to see 63% of our coal fleet retiring in the next 15 to 20 years, the most economical replacements will be wind, solar, storage, and some gas, and storage for us is also hydro. So we're really seeing the shift happening. And the question really became, amidst everything else, can we manage a power system? And unlike many of you who come from much more populated areas, Australia has 26 million people in a region that is the equivalent of the lower 48 in the US. So we like to say we have the longest, skinniest power grid that we're operating in the world. And that presents its own challenges. The question that I ask folks after seeing the work of AirGrid is to really start helping steer what is actually technically capable, because there's a lot of debate, a lot of policy debate. The issue for AEMO as a grid operator is to make sure that we understand what it's going to take to operate a power system with this level of renewable penetration. And we couldn't guess at it. We actually needed to understand it. So we handed it off to Chris and his team, which I'm really very also happy to say is an extremely young team. We have a lot of graduates working on it, and they've done a phenomenal amount of phenomenal work. And I'm really excited for them to share it with you. But the key finding to me is something that we used to say, in New York when we did REV, and is just reinforced in the work that the AEMO's team looked at. And I know many of you have looked at some of these same issues. There's not a technical solution or problem associated with the integration of renewables in terms of it can happen. But we do have to have the right markets in place, the right regulatory in place, and we have to have the right engineering. We also need to steer towards the complexities of operating power systems with using variable renewable energy. And we need to understand also the computing tools that we're going to be needing in the future, the decision-making tools, because it's going to be a very, very different environment. What this is done is when I say is really hopeful, and also the work of ESIG and GPST is to say, well, one thing we know about electricity is that it operates the same way throughout the world. And what we need to understand, and while every system might have a slightly different topology, is what's it going to take to make it work. And so what we wanted to do in our country was to break through the politics, the suspicion, and the fear, and actually provide some engineering analysis of what it's going to take so we could put the path forward. And then also through ESIG and GPST is recognize the technical challenges that we're seeing are significant, but not unsolvable, and will be solved much better if we work together, because they'll be the same challenges everywhere. So I thank you for ESIG and NREL and EPRI for helping us and sponsoring this and getting everyone together. I'm really hoping that this is the beginning of what could be a great conversation and work that we're going to be doing together with our partners to make sure that we're able to solve these issues. For us, has to be between 2025, and I think we're on the right path. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Barry and Chris to this off.
Okay, Audrey, thank you. This is Charlie here again. Just a reminder for those on the line about the question and answer session. Remember that we're handling questions through the Slido platform, so please go to slido.com on your device and enter hash RISESIG to ask questions to the panelists. Okay, thank you, and back to you, Chris.
Charlie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Audrey, for the introduction. And thank you to everyone that's dialed in today. We've got a great number of people flooding in, which is really exciting to see. The report we're going to take you through today has been about 12 months in the making. And I can tell you personally, I'm very excited to be able to share this work with you publicly. Today, we're going to give you an initial overview to the Renewable Integration Study and the report that we published at the end of April. We've tailored the session to suit an international audience, so hopefully you find it useful in your considerations of similar questions for other power systems around the world. As Charlie said, we'll run Q&A at the end of the session using the Slido website. For those of you that haven't used it before, it's a democratic process. So not only can you add your own questions in, but also you can vote up or like the questions that other people have posted, so that the questions that are of most interest to lots of people get to the top first. If you'd like us to note sort of who asked the question, please add your name to the questions when you put them in. And also, if we don't get to answer your question today, or you'd like to engage further after the study, we've got some contact details at the back end of the slide pack where you can reach out to us. As you'll see over the next 45 minutes or so, it really is an exciting time to be considering these questions of renewable integration in the Australian context. And as Audrey noted, we're really looking forward to engaging with all of you in the time ahead. Okay, so just a bit of an overview. Today we'll start with a brief bit of background context, just to help everyone get their heads into the Australian context. And then we'll take you on a tour of the Renewable Integration Study, including sort of its origins, where we started with the work. I'll then hand over to Barry to take you through the main study areas and findings. And then we'll conclude with some key insights for international stakeholders. There's a lot of detail that sits behind the few slides we've covered today, but hopefully we'll give you a good flavour of the study and also some guidance on where you can look for those of you that are interested in delving a bit deeper. All right, so let's get into the detail. As Audrey mentioned, the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, is the independent system and market operator for the national electricity market on the east coast of Australia, which you can see there in the grey hashed. grey hashed area, and also the Western Australian wholesale electricity market, which you can see in the grey area over on the west coast of the country. Today, we're going to be focused on the national electricity market on the east coast. So we'll just take you through a couple of further facts on that grid. For those of you that aren't familiar with our geography, as Audrey said, physically the footprint of Australia as a whole is about 2/3 the size of the US. And we've got a population of about 25 million people. The majority of the population live along the coast, and particularly the east coast. And it's the NEM power system that serves this population with a really long, skinny network. It's about 5,000 kilometres end to end. The system's made up of 5 interconnected regions, which started as mostly independent systems built around each of the state capitals of Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Hobart, down in the island of Tasmania off the south coast. Together, the interconnected system has a demand range of between 15 and 35 gigawatts. And the dominant fuel source to date has been coal generation, plus some large hydro units that exist between Sydney and Melbourne, and also down in Tasmania. As Audrey noted, we currently have 19 gigawatts of wind and solar generation installed, which in 2019 provided 16% of our annual energy. The presentation today outlines our study of the NEM power system, and particularly the technical and operational challenges of operating that system as the generation mix changes. So we started this process with a baselining exercise to look at what other large power systems are doing in their push towards operating with higher levels of renewables. We published that report in October last year. And what we did was looking at the gigawatt scale synchronous island power systems experiencing the highest penetrations of wind and solar generation. And then for each of those, comparing them based on their demand range, their geographic footprint, network topology, the makeup of their generation mix, the level of balancing capability, so the level of interconnection and storage, and a range of other factors. And what you see on this slide gives a comparison of some of those findings. So firstly, and probably importantly, is the comparative geographic footprints and network topologies of a range of those systems. So just to give you a visual representation of the scale that we're talking about for the NEM power system, comparing there to Texas as the next largest, and then Great Britain, and also Ireland and Northern Ireland. This obviously gives you a view of how long and stringy the NEM power system is. The second thing that you can see here is the comparison of 2 key renewable energy metrics using 2018 data. So that's the percentage contribution of wind and solar to annual energy supply, so that's in orange, and then the maximum instantaneous penetration of wind and solar towards meeting demand in the red bars. So that's at any instant in time, how much electricity demand is being met by wind and solar. And it's these high instantaneous penetrations that create the most challenges for us in system operation, and were the core focus of the RIS studies. What we can see in the red bars in the 2018 year is that the highest instantaneous penetration of wind and solar, or the mainland NEM, was 42%, so not too far behind the other international regions there that we studied. If we then look at the state-based numbers, thanks Eloise, you can start to see a sort of a different story emerge. So particularly looking at South Australia and Tasmania, we can see both of those really are already at world-leading instantaneous levels. I guess the key takeaways from this study are sort of, there's a few things. Firstly, as Audrey said, that the underlying physics of all the systems are the same, but also that the sequence of how challenges will emerge differs significantly depending on geographic differences, differences in the existing generation fleets, differences in the level of interconnection and energy storage for balancing, and also where those systems are starting in terms of regulatory designs and market structures. As a result of that, it's hard to make a complete like-for-like comparison. So I just asked my team to stop using the Teams chat. It's giving me an alert message that keeps interrupting. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so as a result, it's quite hard to make a complete like-for-like comparison, but what we can do is look at sort of the relevant individual learnings from each system that's at the forefront of a particular issue or a particular solution approach, and use those to inform sort of the best way forward for our system. What we found in the Australian context was, particularly because of that long skinny network, that there's a number of challenges and issues that we seem to be facing and need to address before other power systems. Two of the main areas are system strength, particularly the connection and operation of large numbers of inverter-based plant in weak parts of the system. And secondly, the challenges associated with operating with very high penetrations of distributed solar PV, particularly in our case, predominantly small residential systems, less than 10 kilowatts each. If you're interested in more detail on the study, I'd highly recommend a look at the full international review report if you haven't already seen it. Okay, so that's sort of the historical view and the starting point. Now let's take a look at where we're going from here. As part of our role as National Transmission Planner, we now produce an integrated system plan every 2 years. And this ISP presents a 20-year view of the least cost expansion for generation and transmission in the NEM for a variety of different scenarios. The draft 2020 ISP, which we published in December, indicates that 61% of coal capacity will close by 2040. And that's really significant, remembering that's been the dominant fuel source since the start of the NEM. It also indicates that 75% of new generation in the future will be wind and solar. While the ISP looks 20 years into the future, the most recent results from that draft 2020 ISP indicate that there are significant changes possible even by 2025. And that includes between 10 and 26 gigawatts of new wind and solar generation, and a potential doubling of the amount of distributed PV that's installed. So just as context, that's on top of the existing 19 gigawatts of wind and solar in a system that has a demand range of 15 to 35 gigawatts. And it's in that context that we started the renewable integration study last year as a complement to our ISP processes, taking the projected future generation mix and network configuration from that scenario planning process in the ISP and delving specifically into the year 2025 to look in detail at the technical and operational complexities of running that system day to day with very high levels of wind and solar. The study as a whole explores the changing needs of the system and also the challenges that we expect to emerge and lay out. It also lays out a series of actions that we need to take to support that transition. So that was a view of instantaneous penetrations, sort of historically in 2018 on the comparison slide. If we take that generation mix from the ISP on the previous slide and then look at, we blow that up to have a look at how that looks for 2025. What you see here in the scatter plot is a view of the instantaneous penetration of wind and solar generation for the whole NEM as a proportion of underlying demand, with each coloured dot here representing a single half-hour period within a year. If we just take a moment to unpack what we're looking at. So the y-axis, we see the range of underlying demand in the NEM. And on the x-axis, we show wind and solar penetration as a proportion of that underlying demand. Noting here that we're including distributed PV here on the x-axis as part of the generation, rather than deducting it from the demand side, which we sometimes do. The grey data set represents 2019 actuals. So that's every half-hour period in 2019. Being actual historical values, this data set includes all the lost energy at that time. So that's network constraints, system constraints, and participant spill. So economic choices that participants make that they may not run their plant at full output. And what we see there is the majority of time in 2019, instantaneous penetrations were below 25%, and a bit of time above 25%, and we had the maximum penetration in 2019 was just under 50% instantaneous penetration. If we look then at the red data set, here we get a view of 2025 based on the resource mix from the central scenario of our draft 2020 ISP. So in this case here, we're looking at a dispatch pattern that includes network constraints, but in this case, we haven't shown any system constraints or participant spill, even though those are captured in the final ISP model. What we wanted to show here was the raw capability of the renewable fleet that could be potentially be there if that generation mix was built out. And in this case, we can see increasing periods of time where we push above 50% penetrations and even above 75% in the most extreme half-hour periods. Finally, then, the orange data set is an alternative view of 2025, this time based on the resource mix from our step change scenario in the draft 2020 ISP. Similarly, this data set includes network constraints, but doesn't include system constraints or participant spill. And in this case, we can see there's enough resource capacity that's being built to potentially push the system up as far as 100% penetration for quite a few half-hour periods in the year. What's immediately apparent looking at this figure is within just 5 years, we have the potential for significant change in the operating conditions that we'd experience in the NEM, even under the generation mix from the central scenario. So that's the red scatter plot. And that's basically just building out generation projects that are already committed to be built. What we've set out to do then is to explore in this study the overarching system limits that at a regional or a whole of NEM level might stop the power system from reaching such high instantaneous penetrations by 2025, and also the actions that we need to explore to manage those. So that's enough for me for now. Just a reminder to everyone to keep posting any questions via Slido. We'll work through these at the end. And a reminder again to add your name if you'd like us to note who asked the question. And I'll now hand you over to Barry, who's going to step you through an initial overview of our main study areas and key findings and actions. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing power system characteristics and the detailed analysis that we carried out for the renewable integration study in subsequent slides. So the first thing we see when we shift from a power system dominated by conventional generation to a power system with higher penetrations of wind and solar generation is that the conventional generation in the NEM has been largely centralized, so built near gas fields or large coal fields. Wind and solar generation can be both centralized with some of the largest wind and solar farms in the world in Australia, but also can be heavily decentralized with the rapid uptake in rooftop solar on people's homes. So for the renewable integration study, the first appendix looks at the challenges with this increasing distributed PV fleet. The second key change we see is around the energy source. So conventional generation are largely firm, so they can store water behind a dam or coal in a power station or gas in a pipeline. Wind and solar energy are largely variable, so they vary based on the availability of the solar resource, which is impacted by the sun rising and setting, but also cloud cover coming across regions, and also the wind energy resource, which comes as weather patterns move across our system. So we did a really big piece of data analysis looking at the variability and the uncertainty with this energy resource historically and out to 2025. And the third key difference between conventional power stations which powered our systems for over 100 years is around the technology, and this is arguably the most difficult part to manage in the transition. So we're going from large electromechanical or synchronous spinning machines to static power electronic inverter based, or sometimes called asynchronous generation. And really the key challenges we have there are around managing the frequency of the power system and also managing the system strength, which I'll talk a little bit of in the second last slide. The last piece is we looked at in the renewable integration study is around how do we bring all of this together and how do the operators operate this system in the future with this sorry, my alarm, time to get up. So how do we operate the system with these changing characteristics into the future? So the first piece I'll go through is on this distributed PV slide. So distributed PV, what do I mean by distributed PV? I mean rooftop solar installed in residential, which is the majority of solar in Australia, is on people's rooftops. Commercial and industrial installed solar photovoltaics. So Australia is, as Audrey and Chris mentioned, has one of the highest penetrations of residential solar, which is largely invisible to operators and uncontrollable to operators. One of the key graphics in the renewable integration study, Appendix A, is shown on the right-hand side here. It's similar to the graphic that Chris showed in the previous slide, but in this it's broken out by region. So South Australia is shown at the top, then you've got Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales and Tasmania. So on the y-axis in this graphic we have gigawatts of demand in the region, and on the horizontal axis, or the x-axis on this, we have the percentage penetration of distributed solar. So the percentage of the underlying demand that is being met by rooftop or distributed solar. The grey dots in this again show every half an hour period for 2019 actual, and the red dots show the every half an hour for 2025 under our projected build for the central scenario, and the orange dots show every half an hour period for 2025 under a more aggressive build out of distributed solar in the NEM. What we can see here straight away is that South Australia has had the highest penetration of distributed solar PV in the NEM, with 65% of demand being met for a single half-an-hour period last year. Victoria and Queensland have around a max of 30% penetration of distributed solar PV for a half an hour. New South Wales around 20%, and Tasmania, which is the lowest, around 15%. What's also shown on this graphic is these lovely colored zones. So these are the zones we've highlighted to highlight the challenges we come into as the penetration of distributed solar PV increases. So zone A on this graphic starts at around 20%. So this is where we see a noticeable impact on the load profile, and this impacts how we operate the system for a few reasons. One is on how our emergency schemes operate. So typically we rely on disconnecting customers if we have very large events on the system, such as multiple generator trips. If our relays are set up to disconnect customers or disconnect load blocks to maintain the system security, when we put generation in the same place, then these schemes may no longer operate, and some areas may actually make the system make events worse, where we have reverse power flows on these feeders. So we need to adapt those systems to make sure that they can keep the system resilient to extreme events that happen on the system. We've had a number of extreme events operating the NEM power system in the last 12 months. We've had bushfires carve up parts of the network into different parcels. We've had interconnector failures where we've had regions of the NEM separated for 2 and 3 weeks at a time. We've had some extremely hot days in the control room where we've had over 40-degree heat across the NEM, and managing that air conditioning load and that peak demand. And also at the moment with the global pandemic, COVID-19, we're seeing a reduction in demand across regions. So one of the main actions that we see coming out of the renewable integration study is operators need the levers to be able to manage a system, especially during these extreme events. And we need a minimum level of curtailability, so a way to switch off the distributed solar PV during these extreme events to keep the system secure and in balance. The second region here we see is Zone B in blue on the graphic, shows where the performance of this distributed fleet becomes critical to the performance of the system. What I mean by the performance, when we have disturbances such as lightning strikes, which are the majority of short circuit faults on the Australian power system, we see mass disconnection of distributed PV in response to these disturbances, which exacerbates or makes worse the outcomes of these. What we also see is when we have faults on the system, a certain amount of load disconnects. So we see air conditioners or customer load disconnecting. And as we push above kind of 28 to 30%, we see that the amount of distributed PV that trips off becomes larger during these faults. And really the actions around this are pointing towards improving the performance of these consumer grade electronics so that they will remain connected to the grid and keep the system resilient. So the main standard we have in Australia is the AS4777. So we're pushing reforms to that standard to make sure that these devices stay connected to the system during events. The last region on the graphic, Zone C here, is where we start to run out of load to keep our large synchronous generators online. Our large synchronous generators are our main providers of some system services on the system, and at the moment we have to keep them online. So as we push out into that zone, we just don't have enough load on the system to keep those generators online. There's a blue line shown in that grey zone, which is the minimum large unit combinations for the region. And interestingly, South Australia and Tasmania don't have a blue line in 2025. And this is mainly because we are installing 4 large synchronous condensers in South Australia over the coming 2 years, which should be able to provide the essential system services in that region, where we also see a new interconnector being built in 2023, which is Energy Connect. So we should be able to operate that system with less or no synchronous units in 2025. Also, Tasmania, which is a really interesting system in its own right and has probably one of the highest penetrations of wind in the world, is predominantly hydro powered system, and those hydro generators some of the hydro generators in Tasmania can operate in synchronous condenser mode, so they can spin without generating energy or spin in air and support the system security at high penetrations. So really the summary on the distributed PV is, if we take action and we update our emergency schemes, we get a minimum level of curtailability, and we improve the performance standards of this distributed PV, we think we can continue the success story of these devices out to 2025, and it's a far better alternative that we would have to impose kind of draconian measures to limit the amount of distributed PV we install in the regions or across the NEM. So these reforms are really necessary to kind of continue the success story. So next slide, please, Al. The next section of the report that we looked at was on variability and uncertainty, and this was a huge data analysis piece with over 500 million data points analyzed using cloud servers with really high granularity down to each wind and solar farm, and also down to 1 minute time frame. Some of the really cool graphics are shown on the right hand side here. I don't have time to kind of talk through them all, but there's a webinar that's going to be published next week on the AEMO website, which will talk through some of these really cool graphics and the analysis that we carried out. So I suppose the key takeaways from the analysis is that historically in the NEM, the fluctuations in underlying demand have driven the large ramps that we see in the NEM. So when people, on very hot days, when people come home and turn on their air conditioning or turn on their ovens, that was the main driver of ramps. Over the coming years, the main driver in ramps in the NEM will be as a result of changes in renewable generation. The next piece we looked at in the study was on forecasting. And we looked at the performance of our forecasting system historically over the last number of years to see how accurate it was at predicting these large variations in output. And what we see is that while we have one of the best forecasting systems in the world in Australia, we still see that there is a level of uncertainty or error in the forecasts. And we need to further adapt our system to be able to get better lead indicators about cloud cover and weather fronts coming across the system. But also we need to take account of that in how we schedule or how we dispatch the system. So the last piece, really, we've got increasing variability, we've got increasing uncertainty. How can our fleet accommodate this increasing level of variability and increasing level of uncertainty on the system? And what we see here is that it's heavily dependent on the decisions made by participants in the energy market. And I suppose what we need to do is adapt our scheduling systems so that we can account for this level of uncertainty in forecast, account for the level of flexibility required to accommodate this increase, and make sure that the system can remain is secure as we transition to this more variable energy source out to 2025. The next section we looked at is The next two sections we looked at are around the reducing number of synchronous generators on the system as we go to higher penetrations of wind and solar energy. So the first section is on frequency stability. So as we go to higher penetrations of wind and solar, we have lower synchronous generators online, which makes the system lighter, or the NEM inertia reduces. As the inertia reduces, it means we need to replace energy faster for large disturbances because the system is lighter, it accelerates faster. And really the actions coming out of this analysis are we need to revise our frameworks so that we can get the right volume of energy and the right speed of energy to be able to keep the system within limits. We need to define a minimum level of inertia for the NEM, similar to the levels which we saw in the international review, which are you see ERCOT or National Grid or EirGrid all have got minimum inertia limits, and the NEM is no different. So we need to define what that limit is and progressively reduce it as we expand the operating envelope of the system. We need to define the rate of change of frequency limits or the acceleration limits of the system in more detail. And the last one on that is that we put in a rule change last year which mandated the primary frequency response from all generators in the NEM. And this was to manage the risk profile over the coming years. So all generators are required now to be frequency responsive when they're operating on the system. There's also further analysis that we need to build on the work that we carried out in the renewable integration study, looking at the, as I mentioned in the DPV section, the impacts on our emergency schemes and our under frequency load shedding schemes. Another one that we've seen in the NEM over the last number of years is a huge uptake in switched reserve or demand response in the NEM, and we need to look at what the impacts that is having on managing the frequency performance of the NEM, and we just need to update our modeling so that we can better account for these for non-credible events that happen on the system. So the next section I'll talk about is system strength. And so system strength really, large synchronous units provide system strength. Wind and solar or inverter-based generators do not provide very much system strength and actually require a level of system strength to operate stably. We've seen a lot of difficulty connecting inverter-based plant in weak areas of the system, so really far away from synchronous generation, where we've had interactions between synchronous generators. The second key challenge we see is around maintaining the minimum system strength for the backbone of the NEM. The graph on the right here shows again the regional breakdowns of a kind of projection of synchronous generation online versus wind and solar, and the exploded one here is for Victoria. So the vertical axis here shows synchronous generation in gigawatts, so you can see it goes anywhere between 3 and 7 gigawatts in Victoria. On the horizontal axis, we can see the penetration or the amount of wind and solar online in gigawatts. The colored dots here show the actual data from 2019. Each color represents the number of units online. So we can see we operated Victoria with just those really sparse number of blue dots there, where we've had 6 large synchronous generators online. But typically we've had maybe 8, 9, 10 units online in Victoria. The grey dots in the background show the projection for 2025 of energy availability. So you can see there's a large amount of operating ground to cover as you push out right into this graph. The grey box on the bottom shows the minimum number of synchronous generators we need online in Victoria, which is determined by PSCAD studies, which is 5 units in that region, and it just shows the amount of operating region we have to cover over the next 5 years as wind and solar increases. Really the actions coming out of the renewable integration study on this are around new mechanisms to value system services and new mechanisms for how to schedule system services. and also around the integrated system plan or national planning role around assessment of market benefits in centrally planning the provision of these system strength services. So the next section I will talk briefly about before I hand back over to Chris is on how we operate the system. So really the biggest challenge we have at the moment operating the system is being pushed towards minimum limits. And what I mean by minimum limits, minimum provision of system strength, inertia and flexibility reserves. Our scheduling system and our energy only market was designed in a time when all of these things came as a byproduct of energy production. So really we need to look at how we redevelop our scheduling system and give more certainty to operators around the provision of these essential services to keep the system secure. We see increasing complexity in the analysis we have to do and to look at system security. And just on the right hand side here is shows the difference in complexity between running a low computational intensity study such as a load flow study, which we run, then a medium computational intensity study, which is kind of looking at like a dynamic RMS type study, which can take anywhere up to around 5 minutes with around 10 computer cores. And then our EMT type analysis, which we run in advance, not online, which can take up to 3 to 5 hours to run a single contingency using 50 computer cores. So we can see the type of analysis we need to do now to look at the increasing complex system is vastly increased. The last piece is really around the increasing variability uncertainty, and as I mentioned previously, we need to incorporate that in our dispatch, and so that operators understand what resources are available at what time, and make sure that the system is secure. That's kind of a very high level summary of the key technical areas of the renewable integration study. I'll hand it back over to Chris now, who will talk about managing the transition. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Barry. So if we bring all that together, if we relate all of those findings back to the original scatter plot that I showed you earlier, we end up with this picture here. Firstly, we've got the progressive overlay of system limits that Barry's just talked us through. So in the yellow here is where we see challenges associated with distributed PV, which need to be managed for wind and solar penetrations above about 25%. Then in the light blue, we see the challenges associated with managing variability and uncertainty starting to come into effect. And that's really from penetrations above 50%. In purple, we see the instantaneous penetrations above which we need a heightened focus on managing frequency and system strength, which is really there being driven by the decreasing number of large synchronous machines online. So based on the generation mix from the central scenario of our draft 2020 ISP and the current operating limits of our existing large synchronous machines, we see the likely penetration limit for wind and solar generation in 2025 being at that dark blue diagonal line, so roughly around 75% penetrations. At this point, we would be operating down to the minimum number of large synchronous generators that we need to maintain system stability, and also we would be operating those down at their minimum stable loading levels. So really, as Barry said, we're down at the minimum limits of the system there. In order to operate at these progressively operate at these high levels, we'd need to have taken all the actions that we've laid out in the report to progressively move our way through the yellow, the blue, and the purple zones. And as I said, if we do all of those, if we take all those actions, we think we think it may be achievable to run the system at up to 75% for periods of time by 2025. If we don't take all those actions, then we'd expect the various system limits would probably cap instantaneous wind and solar penetrations at somewhere between 50 and 60%. It's not a hard system limit specifically, but we think the combination of factors would probably limit things there. If we look to the future, AEMO has not identified any insurmountable reasons why the NEM couldn't be operated securely out into the grey zone, so operating with instantaneous penetrations of up to 100%. To operate at those higher penetration levels, we need to look at solutions either to lower the minimum stable operating points of large synchronous generators, or converting or substituting those with synchronous condensers. With more time, so thinking sort of beyond 2025, it may be possible for advanced inverter technologies to start substituting with those minimum numbers of large synchronous machines. Really, the challenge there, when you're looking at that extremity, we think, is how fast the transition needs to occur. So how soon do we want to be operating out in that range? Okay, so if we wrap all that together, sort of what are the key takeaways, particularly for international stakeholders? Firstly, there's a huge amount of operational territory to cover to get to 75% instantaneous penetrations in the next 5 years. And we really shouldn't underestimate the unknowns that we're going to need to manage and the challenges that we're going to need to work through to get there. Reflecting on that, and also on the pace of change, the study sort of points to the need for establishing market and regulatory frameworks that can adapt swiftly and effectively as our learning evolves, particularly in the space of specifying and quantifying system services, and also in the space of technical standards. So really just having the agility to move as we learn. And that's really important, so that we're always giving clear signals to market about the services that we require, the quantities that we require, and sufficient clarity to ensure appropriate investment and delivery of those services when they're needed. It's also really clear from the work that there's a number of unique system characteristics in Australia, which means we're likely to have to solve some of these integration challenges here first. The positive side is that we've mapped out a clear path of actions, sort of starting from the current system of market conditions in Australia, that if we step our way through those, we think achievably we could get to 75% instantaneous penetrations in the next 5 years. And the exciting thing there is we know what needs to be done, and we've already got the technologies available to make that transition possible. Although I note again that there's a definite need for ongoing technology development to continue driving efficiencies in the way that we evolve the system. Finally, just to repeat something I said earlier, but it really is it's a fantastic time to be considering these questions regarding renewable integration in an Australian context. We've got abundant natural resources. The cost of the technologies is now driving an increasingly rapid uptake as part of our least cost generation mix as the aging coal fleet retires. And we really welcome collaborators who are keen to come and study our system and help us accelerate the management of integration challenges here, so that we can help feed those learnings back to the broader international community. That's about it for the presentation side of things. We're at the top of the hour. We'll open up to questions shortly. So again, just a reminder, if you haven't already, to log into the Slido website with the details that are on the slides, and start posting your questions and voting for the questions of most interest. But before we do that, just a couple of points on sort of further information if you're interested in delving deeper. Firstly, as we've mentioned, there's a series of webinars that we're progressively putting up on the website at the moment to give people I guess a deeper dive into the study. The first two, so the 101 overview and the technical overview, are both up online now. So the 101 is really an introduction for less technical audiences. The technical overview is similar to today's presentation. And then the last three really dive into the detail of some of the areas that Barry was presenting. If you haven't already, I'd also highly recommend taking a look at the reports. We've tried to make them as accessible and easy reading as possible. I think the team's done an excellent job with them, so hopefully you find them an enjoyable and informative read. And then if you're after further details still, there's a number of links and references on these slides, which will be posted shortly to the ESIG website. But also I'd direct you to Chapter 9 of the RIS Stage 1 report, which has a heap of relevant links and references to the other work that we looked at. There's also a number of AEMO contributions progressively going up on the ESIG website as well. There's a few just noted on the slide there, but a reminder to keep your eyes out for those. And then finally, in terms of how you can engage going forwards. So if you've got further questions about the study or you're interested in discussing sort of next steps from here, we'd welcome participation in one of our other upcoming workshops. The next one is we've got a 1.5 hour pure sort of Q&A forum on the morning of June 11th. That's Australian time. Registration for that's free and details are on our website. Also, if you'd like to make a written submission regarding the report, we'd love to hear from you before the end of June. And then finally, if you've got any questions that we don't cover today, and also to lodge any written submissions, please reach out to us at the futureenergy@aemo.com.au email address. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. It's probably a bit cheeky, but we're constantly looking for power system engineers to expand the AEMO team. So if we can tempt any of you with a move to Australia during this exciting transition period, then please keep an eye on our careers website, or the careers section of our website, I should say. Okay. So finally, I'd just like to express a note of thanks to Barry and also the rest of my amazing team, plus the wider AEMO business, and also the members of our external advisory panel for all their collective efforts bringing this project together. It really was a monumental effort, and I think the final product is a testament to everyone that was involved in it. A big thanks today to the event sponsors for the opportunity to present, to ESIG, EPRI, and NREL for helping promote the event and get such a good turnout. And I guess also finally a big thank you to all of you for dialing in and sticking with us, whatever your local time zone is. Barry tells me it's a bank holiday in Ireland, so I do apologise to the guys and girls over there. Yeah, look, it's great to see such a large amount of interest in this work. Hopefully you found this presentation of interest and of value. I'm looking forward to getting through some of your questions now and engaging further after today. So a reminder, if you're not already, to jump on the Slido app. I can see we've got a few questions starting to come through there. Add your name if you'd like us to make a note of who's asked the questions. Thanks, Liz. Okay, so let's take it from the top. First question we have here is, what do you see as the role for grid forming inverters as an alternative to minimum numbers of traditional synchronous generation, and are they enough alone? This is a pretty common question these days, I'd say. What's the role of advanced inverters? I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. I think the first big role that we'd see in advanced inverters is particularly supporting connections in weaker grid areas. That's definitely where it looks like there might be a sort of an initial role for them. The question of to what extent we can start substituting those last big synchronous machines with advanced inverters is really, there's a big open question there. And as I said before, it's a question of how fast do we want to change? I think theoretically that would be possible. I've got a little visitor. Theoretically that would be possible, but
What for that?
we're talking to the world, Harriet. Barry, I might let you take the rest of this question if that's all right.
Yeah, that's okay. Hello, Harriet. So yeah, as Chris said, I think the two applications for grid forming inverters really are on connecting generation in weak parts of the system initially, and whether we could substitute those for the last large synchronous generators. There's a large question mark over it. In order to operate at higher penetrations above 75%, I suppose, looking at how we operate Tasmania and South Australia, we have other technology that we could use to substitute with non-energy providing. So using synchronous condensers or reducing the minimum stable level on our synchronous generation. There are a number of trials going on in Australia at the moment, so we're involved in those trials, which are funded by our by ARENA. So we have the largest grid forming battery in the world, as far as I'm aware, which is the EPRI battery, which is 30 megawatts. And there's also plans for grid forming capability on other batteries. I'm not sure exactly what I can say on this, but yeah, we're working with ARENA, which is the company which is funding these innovative projects, and we are looking at doing a joint paper later this year, early next year, kind of summarizing the work that's going on in Australia and their latest thinking on that topic. But I suppose at a high level, it's a kind of a watch and see space, how the technology develops over the coming years.
Thanks, Barry, and sorry everyone, my little 2-year-old crashing the party. The second question we've got here is a related question. This is from David Ritson. So ultimately, the entire system needs to be redesigned such that it is no longer dependent on synchronous generation to form and maintain grid stability. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, look, it's a good question, David. I think, again, it's ultimately here, this is a question of how fast we want to change. And I think, yes, we absolutely need to reduce the dependence on synchronous generation. That's really clear if you want to make the most use of inverter-based generation sources. Whether we need to reduce our dependence on synchronous machines, I think is the question to be explored. Certainly in the short term, if we want to make this transition really quickly, I think the use of synchronous machines and synchronous condensers for that backbone capability to start sort of displacing those large synchronous generators is the only proven step we've got today. If we had time, if we had sort of 10 years to make the transition, then maybe we could go faster at moving to sort of substitutes for those. But also, I guess one thought I have is old technology is not necessarily bad technology. So sort of the wheel is an old technology, but we rely on that every day. We've got systems that were built around synchronous machines. And while I absolutely think we want to be looking at the sort of the leading advancements in inverter-based capabilities, given that we have to transition from where we are, I don't think we should see it as a bad thing if the least cost enabler for that solution is synchronous condensers or conversion of synchronous machines or innovations in that space. We shouldn't see that as a bad thing. So I think that, as Barry said, there's lots of work to be done there. We're going to be putting out a paper later in the year, sort of delving a bit further into our thinking on that. Barry, I don't know if you want to take this next one, but the question here is, with PS-CAD studies for low short circuit ratios, how does AEMO deal with the confidential black boxed PS-CAD wind and solar models?
So I'm not an expert on PS-CAD studies, but one thing I would say, so participants do submit their black boxed PS-CAD models to AEMO, and AEMO carry out the studies. So they aren't shared with other participants, but we are working on a first of its kind open access kind of PS-CAD where people can log in externally who don't have access to the system model or other PS-CAD models, but can plug in their model and test them and see if they remain stable for lots of different things that they want to look at. So I'm not sure if Christian's still online, if he wants to say something about that, because he probably has more detail on that. But yeah, we're working on how people externally can get access to that without actually accessing the models and confidential information.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question for sort of the increasing dependence on those higher computational intensity studies, but the confidentiality of the models that sit behind them. So it's definitely something we're looking at actively at the moment, is how we can facilitate greater access to those to speed up everyone's use of those models. The next question we've got here is Jonathan Darmani. So the question is, standalone ancillary service technologies are available. However, the lack of revenue certainty is preventing their deployment. Any thoughts on business models? So it's a good question. Thanks, Jonathan. This is definitely, I guess, it's one of the big questions coming on the back of this study. We've been looking at, sort of as a starting point, what are the system limits and where do we see the potential scarcities? The follow-up question on the back of this is obviously, how do you signal the need for those services, and particularly how do you signal them in a way, if you want new investment to come into the market, how do you get those signals there in the right timing and with the right sort of certainty that people can make bankable investment decisions on them? And I guess in the Australian context, that's something that we're working closely with the Australian Energy Market Commission on, and also the Energy Security Board here. They've both got sort of major programs of work looking at these questions. And I think there's a lot of learnings that come out of this study that we can help feed into those processes to, I guess, try and maximise the extent to which there is a strong forward signal for the things that we value, and also that evolves over time. That's something that we've been discussing a bit amongst circles here, is we don't necessarily need the final market or regulatory framework today. If we've got an idea of what we need, then frameworks that allow you to contract for services for a period of time and at least ensure that there is a clear value and a clear investment signal on services, and then potentially migrate to more enduring sort of real-time markets over time, seems like a sensible stepping stone to work through. Barry, I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
No, I think that's a good summary. Just if you look internationally at the work in the UK and Ireland, you're completely right. If you give certainty about revenue streams, the prices for the volumes of, for example, fast frequency response from batteries have been much lower than a market-based outcome, but with the intention to move to more market-based after certain contract periods. So. Yeah, I think it's definitely a big question that the ESB and the AEMC are looking at in Australia, how to best access these services to keep the system secure.
Okay, the next question we've got here, to what extent can long duration storage alone address the maximum instantaneous penetration versus a maximum contribution of annual energy question? This is it's a really good question. I think long duration storage isn't going to solve a lot of the instantaneous penetration challenges that we've been looking at here. It would certainly go along, manage the sort of the flexibility and ramping questions, but a number of the others aren't necessarily going to be solved by storage alone. It's a big question that we've been exploring through the integrated system plan, and there's a lot of work there looking at the difference in value between short-term storage and long-term storage as a complementary part of the energy mix to meet overall annual energy needs. And certainly the latest thinking suggests that long duration storage has a major role, but not the absolute role as part of our least cost energy mix. So there's also going to be a role for other flexible fuels. In our case, gas also has a role in complement with sort of long duration, sort of deep pumped hydro storage, and also shorter duration pumped hydro or battery storage as well. The next question we have here, in reality, renewable output can be curtailed due to transmission distribution limits. How is this issue being considered? Otherwise, the conclusion can be misleading. So this is a good question. The scatter plot that we've used as the basis for the conversation actually includes transmission distribution limits already. So at a distribution level, you can, for those interested, I'd highly recommend a look at Appendix A of the study, which works through sort of bottom up how the different limits are being experienced from distributed PV in the distribution network, and the extent to which that might constrain distributed PV generation. The conclusion there is that while there are localized challenges, we don't see those as being so widespread that they would actually stop the penetrations of distributed PV in the distribution network propagating up to the transmission level. And then at the transmission level, transmission-related constraints are captured in the in that sort of that market simulation that we used for those scatter plots. So the only limits that we left off on those projected plots was the overall system limits, which we've then sort of brought in through that final overlay with those coloured areas. So I guess it's an important takeaway here. We've emphasised it in some of the presentations we've done in Australia, but we didn't touch on it today. But transmission expansion is a critical complement to to this overall transition. And sort of our modelling work here has assumed the transmission expansions that are proposed by 2025 as part of our integrated system plan. So we've sort of taken those as a given, but it's a really important point to make that is if those transmission augmentations don't occur, then you would absolutely be seeing transmission-related constraints that bind before these system limits come into effect. So for anyone thinking about this question on the whole, it's definitely a case of thinking about the order in which different limits bind, whether it's more sort of localized network limits and then you alleviate those, but all of a sudden you hit up against another system limit and you alleviate that and you hit up against maybe a market limit that's stopping a generator or discouraging a generator from operating. And you definitely have to think about it as one total package. Okay. The next question we have here is, to what extent could operational challenges be relieved by increasing transmission capacity between the states? And I guess to the previous answer, our modelling has already assumed transmission expansion, so that's a big focus of our integrated system plan. That really lays out where those least cost and least regret transmission augmentations need to occur, particularly in the area of increasing interconnection between the regions. So that's part of the solution, but it doesn't solve a lot of the challenges that we've laid out here. And the detailed analysis looking at ramping and variability sort of helps give a view on that while there is definitely, while there's definitely a diversity value you get from stronger interconnection and therefore the geographic diversity between variable renewable generator locations, it's still not an absolute solution to managing that variability. I don't know if do you want to take the next one? So the question is, have you investigated high voltage DC as a solution to improve grid strength and frequency stability under the higher 60 and 70% penetration scenarios?
Yeah, I suppose it's a relatively straightforward one from an Australian context. We do have some HVDC in Australia. In Australia, the largest being the one between Victoria and Tasmania. So it currently does share reserves between the regions, so it could be used to improve frequency stability. But unlike other countries which have are closer to other systems and can interconnect and can rely on other systems to provide frequency stability or fast frequency response, the NEM is already interconnected and is quite far away from the closest system. From a grid strength point of view, there's two types of HVDC, line commutated converter, which is the one to Tasmania, and voltage source converters, which are the newer type technology. Both actually require system strength to operate, so they actually require a base level of system strength similar to wind and solar. So at the moment, their commercial technology that's available couldn't actually provide grid strength. I know of a trial which was used in the east-west interconnector where they started a coal power plant from the UK with a HVDC interconnector, but it really goes back to the question of can you keep multiple grid forming inverters synchronized to each other And I don't think there's any example worldwide, but I'd be very interested to hear if anybody on the call has an example of where multiple grid forming inverters are operating side by side and staying stable. So the answer for this one really is we're not close enough to another system to rely on it, but we do use HVDC within the system. So.
Thanks, Barry. Hopefully that answers the question. So the next question we have here is one on under-frequency load shedding. So the question is, this is from Guy Zito. Thanks, Guy. What will AEMO do about high penetrations of distributed energy resources effects on automatic under-frequency load shedding? So I've actually, the team has been trying to answer some of these questions in the background. So Rama Ganguly, who was one of the leads for the distributed PV works, actually answered this one here. Rama, I don't know if you want to say a few words as well, but the short answer here is that. Oh, perfect. I will throw to you, Rama.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So yeah, clearly from impact here is just reducing load available for shedding in schemes like this in UFS and other sort of similar schemes. It is a known an issue that we are trying to work through for South Australia, and we do anticipate that that by about 2021, 2022, we would need a redesign of the scheme, and that might be involving adding additional load, but probably more likely just a redesign of the actual logic and the relays to discriminate between locations that are net generators and net loads. At the minute, as of today, the scheme is shedding loads from let me translate to global language. So MV to LV, or MV level of the distribution network, net 11 kV feeders. So longer term, we'd need to have a serious rethink about a more granular, lower level mechanism there. So all those options are being explored at the moment. A lot more detail in our appendix.
Thanks, Rama. I just do a time check with Charlie. I think we've still got another half an hour in the session. Is that right, Charlie?
Yes, that's right. Had to get back from Slido over to the webinar here. Yeah, we're planning to end at the end of this hour. So we've got another 30 minutes.
Perfect. So the team's trying to answer some of the questions in the background as well. So if there are, make sure we try and get through as many as we can.
Yeah, one thing I would say, if there's any other people that join in to answer questions, if they could be sure to speak close to the microphone so we can pick up the audio okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie. Okay, the next question we have here is from Henry Huang. So the question is, beyond maintaining minimum inertia, what are the challenges to run the grid as a more responsive system with low inertia? Andrew Paver, I don't know if you want to take this question. Andrew was our stream lead for the frequency management studies. Is probably best placed to give you an answer on this one, Henry. And just to Charlie's question, Andrew, just make sure you're close to your microphone.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So what we looked at for the renewable integration study is particularly frequency stability, but as the question suggests, there's lots of other things that can happen as the inertia.
You're very low, Andrew, there. Can you speak up?
Yeah, I don't know if this is better. So
that's better, yeah.
Lots of other things can happen as the inertia on the system decreases, particularly in the area of small signal stability and dynamic stability. So what we've recommended in the study is that we need to progressively manage that system inertia as we go towards lower levels.
Still with us, Andrew? Lost you.
Yeah, so particularly for Australia, because we have a long and stringy system which can have parts of the system island, a lot of attention goes into managing islanded parts of the system, and that's where AEMO puts a lot of its focus.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Andrew. And Henry, I'd point you to the frequency management report. That really there's a lot of detail there in terms of, I guess, the questions about sort of different trade-offs between different reserve speeds and the questions that we need to probe if we want to sort of operate at lower inertia rather than necessarily replacing all of that. The next question we have here says there's another 10 to 20 gigawatts of wind and solar expected for 2025. How are the delays that new plants are suffering for connecting to the grid going to affect that plan for 2025? And look, it's a good question. I guess the first thing I'd say is that the scenarios that we've used here are not we're not trying to say this will be the system in 2025. That's the scenarios, so they're possible futures, and that the ISP gives a range of possible future outcomes. And really what the study does, while we picked the 2025 resource mix, really the findings of the study are time agnostic. So if connections take longer than expected, then it takes us longer to get to those targets is the short answer. I guess the other half of that question, which I touch on, is that there's a lot of work that AEMO is doing to try and facilitate connections and streamline the connection process. And there'll be a lot of work in the final integrated system plan that we publish in the middle of this year, looking at sort of opportunities to sort of pursue scale efficient solutions to sort of connecting clusters of renewables and in particular renewable energy zones, and really trying to streamline and fast track things to simplify that process. So it's something that we're acutely aware of, and we're very committed to working closely with participants to ensure that there's minimal delays on the connection process. But on the flip side, in terms of, I guess, this study and the broader questions of system limits, really what these results give us is a view of what needs to be done by what penetration level. So if connections happen faster, then we need to go faster on the actions, and if connections happen slower, then potentially we've got some more time to get prepared. So hopefully that answers that question. The next question we have here is it the economic dispatch that displaces synchronous generators as more renewables come in, or do you always give priority dispatch to renewables? I don't know, Barry, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So there is not priority dispatch on renewables in Australia. It is economic dispatch that displaces synchronous generators or renewables. So an interesting difference between how the price is set in Australia. If a synchronous generator is required to be online for system service, they are compensated after the fact to be online, and they do not set the market price in the NEM. So unlike if you look at I think National Grid and in Ireland, the last synchronous generator that has to be kept online for system services set the price. So we see a lot of volatility in the price in Australia. So we can see pretty low negative prices in times when there's a lot of wind or solar in the middle of the day. So we can see minus $1,000 on the price, and actually that negative price, because of the way some renewable plant are set up contractually wise, they respond to that negative price, so they might actually curtail themselves because they would lose money during those periods. So it's something that was new to me when I looked at the system here, but we called it participant spill. So if generators will lose money because of negative prices, they come offline because they're not insulated from that price. And we see some price responsive events where we see the price go negative, generators come off, then they come back, and then the price goes positive and they come back online, and then they keep responding to the price. So it's a known issue around that.
Thanks, Barry. Sorry, just struggling with my mute button. Okay, the next question we have here says the report seems to assume that the current NEM design is not fit for purpose. Can Australia use the current market as it is with better incentives for future variable renewable energy? This is a good question. So, and it's an interesting question for other system operators as well, because for everyone, this transition is a question of where we're starting from. What is your starting point in the system? I'm not sure that you would say that the current NEM design as a whole is not fit for purpose. What the study highlights is a number of areas where we need to make improvements to make sure that we stay ahead of these changes. And there are two sort of significant processes underway in our context pursuing those changes. So one is the ongoing work from the Australian Energy Market Commission, or the AEMC, who make our rules, looking at a variety of changes and reforms to manage these security questions. And then also the broader program of work being run by the Energy Security Board, which is sort of taking a longer term view post 2025 and any enduring market reforms that need to occur. So what we're working towards on the back of this study is building on the actions and recommendations for reforms that the studies come up with, producing a more integrated map of all of the different sort of technical requirements of the system and the relative priority of both operational actions and things that AEMO needs to do, but also relative priority of different reform activities, both in the short term and the longer term, to manage those issues. So I think it's the real benefit here is we've now got a really useful view with these results of what that potential future system could look like in the not too distant future. And then you can start to extrapolate from there in your thinking about even higher renewable futures in the longer term, sort of 10 years plus out, where you're seeing these same sorts of events just happening more frequently and more regularly. I don't know, Barry, do you want to add anything to that one?
No, I think that's a pretty good answer. Like I just echo the fact that the NEM does really trying to highlight the areas where we need to improve. So sometimes they can seem negative on some things, but we're trying to highlight the challenges and come up with actions to kind of push to higher penetrations. So yeah, I think it's more a case of adaptation than redesign for a lot of things for most power systems internationally. So
yeah. And what I'd say is there's a lot of good work already happening in that space, and the report sort of flags that there's not too many of the actions where we're flat-footed as an industry and starting from scratch. There's a lot of things already moving in that space. The next question we have here, for high penetration renewable power systems, do you think that daily cycling of conventional plants is technically and economically viable? This is an excellent question, and the fleet flexibility study that we did, so that's in Appendix C in the variability and uncertainty work, really tries to sort of highlight some of the important questions around this particular idea, and I think is going to be one of the major challenges during the transition period. So we've got new market rules coming in the next few years to drive us towards a 5-minute settlement timeframe instead of a 30-minute settlement timeframe to align with our 5-minute dispatch periods. And the view is that will, over the long term, drive greater flexibility into the market and the fleet. But the interim period, where we're reliant on the existing fleet, particularly in our case, a lot of older coal plants, it definitely looks like the pressure is going to be on them to cycle more frequently, to find ways to lower their minimum generation points. And I think there are some really tricky questions there from a technical level for those plants, but also from a sort of overall system reliability perspective. If increased cycling of those plants reduces their online time, increases failure rates, do you end up creating risks where we've got insufficient generation for peak days because critical plants end up out of service? Yeah, I don't think we've got a direct answer yet, but I think the study shines a light on some of the questions that need to be probed there in more detail, and that's definitely one of the focal questions for the transition for sure. The next question we've got here is from Chandu in New York. The question is, can you comment on forecasting requirements, particularly short term, so 5-minute or 10-minute, coming in the future for renewable generators? Eloise, I don't know if you want to have a go at this one. Eloise was our workstream lead for the variability and uncertainty work.
Yeah, I can provide a bit of light on this one. So in the NEM, AEMO actually provides forecasts for our large-scale wind and solar farms. So these are solar and wind farms that are typically greater than 30 megawatts or have a significant impact on our constraint formulations. So what we get from our wind and solar farms is high granularity SCADA data. For the wind farms, we get it on wind speed, wind direction, high wind speed cutout, so a whole lot of metrics on the farm, and they get fed into our AEMO models, which provide 5-minute forecasts and then also forecast on a 5-minute granularity out to a rolling hour ahead. And we also have additional forecasting platforms which provide forecasts out to a day ahead and also a week ahead. So these are forecasting requirements that are already in place for our wind and solar farms.
Thanks, Elle. And I think, one of the interesting takeaways from the study is I think we've already got fairly advanced forecasting systems in place, and I guess to what extent do we hit up against limits in those forecasts, particularly for the longer ahead timeframes, and then you head into questions of kind of how much of that uncertainty can you iron out, and then how much is left that you actually need to manage with some kind of risk management approach. The next question we've got here has DPV, so distributed PV modelling, taken into account future uptake of batteries as battery prices decline and Australian government subsidies. The Australian government subsidises batteries to support rooftop solar. So Rama's provide a written response to this one there. But the short answer is that yes, those drivers are captured in the forecasting scenario development for the ISP that we used as an input to the study. So basically whatever battery storage is there is captured as a soak in the modelling. So it increases the load at those points in time.
I think it would be worth adding that I think Australia, I saw statistics, Australia installed 35% of the world's home batteries in 2019. So there is a lot of distributed batteries going in, and it's included in the analysis going out to 2025 sort of projections, as Chris said.
Yeah, it's a good point, Barry. And I think also another sort of observation is that a lot of the operational challenges we look at are harder if you're trying to go to high penetrations at times of low demand. So anything that increases demand, particularly energy storage, can have a significant benefit on sort of diminishing the number of challenging operational periods. And that's increasingly important when you look at one of the recommendations Barry mentioned there is the need for sort of an emergency curtailment functionality to be able to get distributed PV off the system during extreme abnormal events at times where we've just got too much distributed generation and not enough load. And the study points out sort of that curtailment capability is a critical backstop, regardless of what we do, if we want to keep installing these devices. But if we push the uptake of distributed batteries, or even larger batteries at the distribution level, that sort of diminishes the number of periods of the year where you've got potential challenges. So it reduces the need that you'd ever have to rely on those emergency backstop measures. So it's definitely something we've got a keen interest in. The next question we've got here is from Glenn Drover. And the question here is about gas usage in the ISP model. So the question is, the ISP model has gas usage drop from 15 terawatt hours per year to 5 terawatt hours per year, even for 2022, which seems like the model settings did not dispatch the open cycle gas turbine peaking plant. Will this change in the final ISP? This isn't one that I'm directly close to, but I can see Rama's provided an initial answer to this. So I don't know, Rama, do you want to say a couple of words on this one?
Yeah, sure, Chris. So can everybody hear me okay? I think there were some issues last time.
Yeah, just keep your mic close.
Yeah. So yeah, as I sort of hinted at in my response there, it's really just a function of the available flexibility within the pool of resources that's considered in the model, and you know, the cost assumptions around those sources of flexibility. So you know, we've in our forward planning, there's been a bit of a focus now on pumped hydro storage and utility scale battery storage, and their role in sort of the overall energy sufficiency and balancing questions into the aspects into the future. So really at this point, I think it's just coming down to cost. There's a lot more information on our website about that, but the recent sort of revision we've done prior to the final ISP has been around cost inputs with respect to batteries in comparison to pumped hydro. So Really, that's probably the main change we'd expect from draft to final. But yeah, no, definitely worth looking into the precise inputs on our website on gas peaking plant.
Thanks, Rama. The next question we have here is one about climate change objectives. So the question is, as per the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, we need to get to zero or very low carbon by 2040, closing 61% of coal capacity by 2040 is therefore insufficient. So that what I'd say to this one is that 61% closure rate comes out of our ISP modelling, and the way that we approach that modelling is through the different scenarios that we model, we look at different legislated climate targets in Australia, and also the step change scenario in this year's ISP, I think tried to go to a more extreme view, but I'm not sure if it went to the full extreme of the sort of the objectives to meet the 1.5 degree targets. But the closures there of the coal plant are based on expected closure dates and announced closure dates by participants. So I think that there's a lot of work to go in terms of sort of how Australian policy targets change in response to global climate targets, and we'll be continually updating our modelling projections based on those. So it's not necessarily something that we have direct control over under our sort of within our remit. Okay, we've got a question here from Barry Mather. For synchronous and non-synchronous limits, what are the assumptions for synchronous dispatch of conventional generation? Are those based on market needs or inertia needs? It's a good question, Barry. That ultimate sort of limit that leads us to the 75% limit is based on a system strength requirement. So in the NEM, we have rules that came into effect 2 years ago that specify minimum fault levels that need to be maintained at particular nodes around the network. And it's the analysis that we've done on stable combinations of large synchronous machines to meet those minimum fault level requirements that we use to determine the I guess the minimum combinations of machines and also the stable minimum loading levels of those machines to come up with that absolute limit. Barry, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I suppose it's on the technical needs, as Chris had said, and the market modeling we've done using a number of different simulations, one based on the least costs, another one's based on bidding models, and another one based on Nash equilibrium. So just the projections we've put in this report are based on the least cost, short and marginal cost projections, and the limits are binding physical limits for system security.
Thanks, Barry. Look, we've got 5 minutes left. Probably got time for maybe one more question, Charlie, and then I'll throw back to you for some closing remarks.
Sure, sounds good.
So we've got a question here from Andy Hoke. Are you considering replacing legacy distributed inverters to avoid mass DER tripping, and would this need to be incentivized? So this is a good question, Andy. The short answer is no. For the most part, our focus is on capturing sort of new inverters that are installed, and I guess in an incidental sense, you would then progressively get a replacement of the legacy inverters as they reach end of life and need replacing. But for most parts of the NEM, we think the legacy fleet can be accommodated as is. We have said in the report, we do want to look at whether there's a need and an economic, A, a need, and B, sort of practicality and economic sort of possibility of any upgrades to existing inverters, particularly in South Australia, given its really high existing penetrations. So that's a piece that we're looking at, but with caution, I suppose. It's something we'd like to avoid if we can.
Just to add one thing on the mass disconnection from. There's been a good bit of work looking at bench testing the inverters, and it's not all manufacturers or models of inverters strip. Some are more resilient than others, so there is a difference in the fleet that's out there as well. So not to tar everybody with the same brush, every manufacturer that they're disconnecting for events.
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't got through everyone's questions. Apologies. We've got through, I think, quite a few, and the team's been trying to answer some of the last questions there as well. As I said earlier, if we haven't answered your question, but you would like a response, please reach out to us directly at the futureenergy@aemo.com.au email address, and we'll endeavour to get back to you on that as soon as we can. Thank you. I'll throw back to you, Charlie.
Okay. Thank you very much. We went right up to the end of the 2 hours and still a lot of questions to go, but we need to wrap it up. So as I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the presentation and audio file have been posted, and we'll do our best to answer the follow-up questions, but we may not get to all of them. Audrey, Chris, Barry, I want to thank you again for this really outstanding webinar. I thank all of you who participated for your interest. I'd like to let you know that AEMO and ESIG also planned an ESIG Down Under Renewables Integration Workshop for April of this year, which has been moved online due to the coronavirus. The workshop is being planned by ESIG and AEMO for the month of July, and it will go into many of the topics we covered today in more detail. Webinars are being held at no charge, so all of you are welcome to register. Further information on these and on our other webinars from the ESIG Forecasting and Markets Workshop, which will be held during the month of June, can be found on our website at www.esig.energy under events. In the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye now.